Yeah, thanks, Alex. First of all, I just want to thank George Washington University Program on Extremism for hosting this, and of course the panelists, Megan, Alex, yourself. Also, just sort of a shout out to both of you. To begin with, I just want to start on my piece of the pie, which was essentially, and my role in regards to this paper was essentially looking at sort of this shifting sort of aesthetics, content, and sort of communities, fringe communities that were coming out that were considered quote unquote salad bar extremism, hybridized, however you would like to put it, and trying to put a more sort of definitional framework around what we were seeing around a sort of shift in aesthetics, content, and ideology in some ways. But first, before you begin, you have to look at sort of the shifting sort of landscape around radicalization and the internet in the United States and also beyond, but primarily in the US. When you're looking at people under 30 in the US, according to the PIRUS data set, the number of radicalized people with no formal allegiance or ties to recognized extremist or terrorist groups has jumped about 311% in the past 10 years as compared to the past 5 decades. So there's a shift that's taking place there, at least from what the data is telling us based on the PIRUS database. Similarly, and this could go probably more towards the internet itself, but since 2010 and 2020, the internet has played a primary role in the radicalization process for those under 30 and has jumped about 413% as the previous decade. So you have these two sort of simultaneous things happening that are essentially shifting the way that these communities operate online, how they define themselves, how they pilfer from each other in a number of ways, and essentially how they're made up. So to do this, while real-world cases may seem like outliers in sort of terrorism-linked investigations nationally, it is indicative of a larger trend where the two spheres of REMV and Islamism are becoming increasingly indistinguishable in some sense. Requires understanding the content continuum in the extremist milieus that have long existed online. So there are a number of sort of, I would say, factors that play into why the content and aesthetics of these two desperate communities, if you will, are sort of beginning to converge. And you can go back to 2016, the Great Meme War. You can go back to things that are related to Gamergate, for instance. You can also tie this into the sort of rise of mass casualty attackers, school shooters, if you will, and how that is shaping the content of desperate groups online. So to do this, we were looking at reviewed court records of some indicative case studies, not all the case studies that we could bring in into this. Analyzed some 9,000 memes and meme videos from Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, and Twitter, as well as messaging-based applications such as Telegram and the closed platform Discord, gaming adjacent, collected between 2020 and 2022. And we classified that content into a framework based on idiosyncratic terrorism, first developed by Jesse Norris in 2020, which I'll discuss a bit more further, and why I particularly gravitated towards Jesse's or Dr. Norris's classification system. So first, in terms of case studies, we looked at several. I'm just going to highlight 3 here. Omar al-Khattoul, which we could classify as the quote unquote the LARPer. If you look at his case in 2021, and he was arrested for making threats to synagogues. In 2021, he tells an audience on a Telegram chat that he's currently in an Iran enjoyer phase, end quote, but has also become a Taliban supporter and Iran supporter at the same time, end quote. And these are direct quotes taken from the Telegram chat in public records. In November 2022, and this was in late 2021, he creates a manifesto written in the past tense titled "When Swords Collide" and claims he has committed, quote unquote, an attack on the Jews. And this suggests to prosecutors as well as investigators that he was plotting an attack of some kind on a synagogue and sort of matches up with his activities offline. And then in December 2022 through February 2023, he says he's moved on to Al-Qaeda and believes that the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria are Khawarij or outsiders. And in March 2023, he fully supports ISIS and tells an audience on Discord and Telegram. He similarly, at the same time, tells the same audience on Discord and Telegram he's LARPing as a quote-unquote jihadi. He creates a video montage of Dylan Roof, the neo-Nazi perpetrator of the heinous attack on an African-American church in South Carolina that resulted in the deaths of 9 people. And he believed the churchgoers killed in the attack perpetrated by Roof were Christcucks, which is a term that is directly taken from Chan culture, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and that Muslims in the West should specifically learn from Roof. And so what you can see here is just the speed at which someone is radicalizing, the sort of shifts in the sort of ideological space that he is at, and then simultaneously the sort of the interplay between what's online and what's in the real world is not the same, even though there are obviously moves offline that are taking place where he's sort of parceling out his online activity versus his offline. And you can kind of see that very clearly here. Next are some older cases that Alex also similarly dredged up and we went into sort of background on. Emerson Bulgogi, whose father introduces him to Nazism as a child, and mother says he really became interested in Nazism in 2001. He was an administrator of an English language Salafi jihadist forum, posts things like a quote unquote a successful lone wolf attack when it kills 1 or 2 or 3 or kuffars better than an unsuccessful massive attack, which also results in your own arrest. And we've seen that sort of narrative in neo-Nazi accelerationist circles as well in the later half in the 2020s. Under a pseudonym, he asked jihadist forums to use firearms, explosives, propane tanks, sort of conduct your own DIY style attack Jewish schools, day centers. Again, a part and parcel of all of these communities is fervent anti-Semitism, hatred for LGBTQ plus communities, and similarly a desire to conduct as much wanton violence as possible. And he repeatedly tells his brother he wants to die as a martyr and take care of others with him. And his friends claim that a white supremacist group called him and asked that he lead a Nazi movement. So you have this sort of intermingling between the two in this specific case. And the same with Nicholas Young, where you have a District of Columbia Metro Transit officer, has a tattoo of a German eagle on his neck and the SS logo on his arm, collected Nazi memorabilia. He dressed as Jihadi John with a fake beard and a hostage for Halloween. He bookmarked, investigators later found 36 selfie jihadists and Nazi sites on his own computer, was an avid video game player. He set up an account on Facebook in the name of a Warhammer 40,000 character and shared photographs of the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Mohammed Amin al-Husseini, meeting with Adolf Hitler, saluting Nazi troops, and he denied terrorist links and claimed to have traveled to Libya twice to topple Gaddafi. So there is background of actual cases, and of course there are others that we can get into more recently that are linked to the Order of the Nine Angles and others that have sort of had this sort of ideological interplay for a while. So we know that it's happening offline. What does it look like online, and how is it metastasized? So when we looked online, we really wanted to get away from this. Look, we're referring to all of this stuff as salad bar extremism, mixed and unclear, unstable ideologies, reciprocal radicalization, ideologically fluid, hybrid ideologies, composite violent extremism. Really what I was looking at, and in my estimation, I'm glad, I will gladly argue this with others and have a good back and forth, is that we're thinking about idiosyncratic terrorism. So what is idiosyncratic terrorism? Well, there's 4 dimensions to it. It was developed by Jesse Norris in 2020. And idiosyncratic terrorism is essentially idiosyncratic ideologies, tactics, strategic thinking, and motives. And so part of that is, it's great. That encapsulates what I'm seeing online through this data set. But at the same time, missing from this discussion was sort of content and the role of idiosyncratic content as a part of tactics and or strategic thinking. So contact plays a central role in defining and even creating new idiosyncratic ideologies, especially online. And we've seen this over the years and how it shifts. You have fringe groups that have sub-fringe groups that are a part of them. And we'll talk about this in a minute. And so from there, what we were able to sort of identify are several support communities from our data set that could be traditionally defined as neo-Nazis, which will be broken down according to Nazi Salafi, Nazi Shia distinctions. But we also saw Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, or Iran-backed militia hubs that have intra-group idiosyncrasies, which ultimately influence the development of their communities, their ideologies, their tactics, strategic thinking, and motives. And we define these groups of supporters as neo-Nazi Salafis, neo-Nazi Shia, Chan Iran-backed militias, alt-Islamic State, and alt-Qaeda to create a distinction between them and others that inhabit the same ideological ambit. This was previously, and I had previously referred to this in another paper, as the quote-unquote alt-jihad. This grouping of alt-jihadists is actually a microcosm of multiple fringe communities, often at odds with one another, united in their own use of idiosyncratic terrorist content. They're feeding off of one another. And so what does this content look like? Well, in terms of breakdown, when we sort of tried to classify it, a lot of this from what we had in our data set, and we're talking about 9,000 memes, 9,000 memes and videos, meme style videos. It included predominantly alt-Islamic State content. However, this was closely followed by Chan Iran-backed militias, neo-Nazi Shia, Al-Qaeda, and neo-Nazi Salafis. What are these communities and how did they come about? Well, these online communities are primarily spread across Telegram. They're also frequently using closed platforms such as Discord to share content. Most notably, and similar to claims by Al-Qatul, who I mentioned in the case study section, these online communities often claim that they're in fact LARPing to obfuscate their true ideological leanings and motives. And we found that idiosyncratic commonalities run through all these communities, namely the appropriation of Chan culture's aesthetics and language. So as you can see here, here's one from a Chan-backed Iran militia group that is supportive of Hezbollah and supportive of Russia and its aims and invasion of Ukraine, where you have Sergei Lavrov saying that Hitler has Jewish blood, and then more than them pouncing on it and claiming that he's speaking facts. And so the adoption of the same aesthetic and language by ideologically different groups such as Rembi's and Islamists is idiosyncratic in and of itself. It's also emblematic of two central environmental factors: the global spread of Chan culture, so the sort of aesthetic language that came out of 4chan and other forums, 8chan, you name it, and the global spread and sort of a younger generation of supporters for a range of different extremist groups. We're having a shift in terms of demographics in regards to a support, and what that sort of shift comes is essentially a shift in the content, aesthetics, and language. And so previous research has highlighted to some extent, and this is getting into neo-Nazi Salafism or Salafist National Socialists. Previous research has highlighted the extent to which there is a crossover between these communities. While self-professed neo-Nazi Salafis may draw partially on the ideological precepts of the Order of Nine Angles, which is O9A, they similarly have, which is an occultist neo-Nazi accelerationist group, they similarly have a deep animus towards O9A, despite sharing some of its founding doctrine. And its members have lost Telegram-based raids on O9A Telegram channels. So you actually have a sort of distinction there that highlights a dynamic. And this dynamic indicates that neo-Nazi Salafis may fall into the mixed ideological space. However, there are fringe groups that are rejecting sort of within this spacing, the traditional poles of mixed ideological trailblazers, read O9A, and are developing their own idiosyncratic doctrine, content, narratives. And so you have groups on Telegram that are set up as Salafist National Socialists that are based in Germany, they're also based in the US, that are functioning and trying to develop their own political platform. This includes things such as the Red Caliphate. Now, neo-Nazi Shias. Now, this exists, like neo-Nazi Salafis, the neo-Nazi Shia communities have developed sort of an idiosyncratic doctrine that goes beyond Nazi Germany and includes influences from the Iranian Sumka party. The Sumka party is the National Socialist Workers' Party founded in Iran and allegedly supported by the CIA. Its philosophy views Persians as the original Aryans. And by claiming to be historically linked, the neo-Nazi Shia communities use that legacy of the Third Reich to fawn over ideologues such as Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler on popular platforms such as Facebook or YouTube, and use Telegram to organize and build out communities. Very distinct from the other sort of Islamist-based neo-Nazi communities that we saw that have that affinity. Similarly, Chan Iran-backed militias. So these supporters, typically supportive of Hezbollah or other groups operating in Iran, in Iraq, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, have developed their own ecosystem of alt-right infused aesthetics that draw on racist tropes of Arabs, as well as sectarian tropes of Sunnism, often attacking Salafis due to the latter. So there's a lot of sort of inter-fight, sort of inter-conflict dynamics there. Part and parcel of this community is a fervent support for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad because he has outlasted his detractors. One of the key content-based idiosyncrasies of this community is the likening of Sunnis to Jews based on fervent anti-Semitism, but also anti-Arab sentiment and recent geopolitical events that include the diplomatic thaw and economic ties forged between Gulf states and Israel. Other terrorist idiosyncrasies stem from the use of aesthetics and areas of this community that tie into regional geopolitics linked to Iran and Iran-backed militias, with Chan culture tropes around quote-unquote Sunni cucks and support for Hitler for orchestrating the Holocaust. So you're seeing a dynamic there that is similarly defining this community from others. And then last but not least, and I've lumped them together, alt-Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. And these are, as previous research that we've led into Gen Z Salafi communities indicated, support for the Islamic State in these digital ecosystems is rife with contradictions, all right? So Islamic State's violence was applauded by these alt-Islamic State supporters, but the ideological precepts were often rejected, highlighting a sort of internal idiosyncrasy that exists within these communities. So again, we're seeing idiosyncrasies within an idiosyncratic community that is using far-right or extreme right aesthetics and Chan culture to sort of define itself online. Support for Al-Qaeda in the data set was less of an alignment with the precepts of ideological components central to the group and more about their ideologue. So it's ideologue based rather than sort of an ideology. So Osama bin Laden, Anwar al-Awlaki, what ultimately differentiated Al-Qaeda from traditional supporters of Al-Qaeda online was its use of Rembi aesthetics. So Al-Qaeda content producers do their focus on ideologues rather than group message or operations, were more likely to get widespread support from other Salafist jihadist channels by mixing their content and discourse with that of Rembi's. So you bringing in Hitler, bringing in other sort of notable Chan characters, such as Pepe the Frog, who obviously has a history before he was sort of reappropriated by the far and extreme right and alt-right. And that sort of defines this community. And with that, I'm going to close on this section. However, it's important to note that as long as we develop these sort of broad-based sort of definitions of communities or try to lump them, we need better classification systems for what we are seeing online. And we need to be able to tell people, yes, this is a community that exists. Here are its basic ideological precepts. Here's how its content and its ideology is promoted. Because ultimately, if we're going to focus on degrading or disrupting these communities, we need to understand them first.
Thanks, Moustafa. Really useful. And just before I go to Megan, just to pick up on two things that you mentioned. I think one, in terms of just the role of the internet, right, that you talk about, and of course, it's almost kind of a cliche at this point to keep talking about the role. Of course, it has a role, but it's what we note as well in the report is that it's actually there's a kind of it's the move away from formal group affiliation to kind of more diluted type of online involvement. So the internet has allowed for the move away from the formal groups, right? It's allowed a space for extremists to operate without needing formal groups. But this also connects us directly to the mixing question, which is, when you had formal group affiliation, when formal groups, generally you were quite good at policing their members, what they believed, who they affiliated with, the roots of their beliefs, and all this. Without that policing going on anymore, you're actually finding that these different types of extremists who are drawn to certain different types of extremism are in some cases finding a lot more in common with people they otherwise wouldn't have been able to hear from because of that, the more formal kind of policing component, leadership policing. So, and that takes me to the second point, which is that this overlap that you're talking about between different types of Islamists, Salafis, and sort of right-wing Islamic groups and the extreme white supremacist types. It's not some random thing, right? It's not, and this is some of the discourse around it kind of suggests it's this kind of crazy pick and choose salad bar situation where it's just, whatever's going on the day, that person's picking up and justifying their violence with. No, there's more logic to it than that. It's not a coincidence that these two groups, the two most preeminent non-state, extreme movements today, I would say, are finding common cause. It's not a coincidence. In fact, they're both, and I've gone on about this a lot, so apologies to those of you who attend these PoE events a lot, because you've heard this from me many times, Moustafa has as well, is that you're talking about two groups who essentially have very, very similar concerns and very, very similar views about why their in-group is struggling. They're both surveying their societies and have kind of decided and that the biggest problems that they have are kind of the influx of liberal thought, certainly of certain postmodern, but also pre-postmodern liberal thought, and particularly things like pluralism, sexual freedom, and they are viewing their societies in a kind of moral decline. As a result of these essentially liberal leftist ideas. And of course, they both view the hidden hand of Jewish power as being absolutely central to this kind of moral, ethical decline of their in-group, intentional as well, an intentional attempt to morally deprave their in-group, be it, whites, be it Muslims. And the people doing this targeting are basically the same. As far as these two are concerned, so they have a very similar view, and then of course they have different visions for how this all turns out. But for now, in this phase they're in, which is the kind of rebellion phase, they have very little to disagree on. So anyway, sorry to cut into your